Hi, welcome to Sandy Says. This is Sandy Dimiterchik with SARTA, Schizophrenia and Related Disorders Alliance of America. I am the SA staff supporter, the resource and liaison for potential or current SA group leaders. SA stands for Schizophrenia Alliance, Psychosis, Support, and Acceptance, and they are peer-led support groups for people with schizophrenia or related disorders, including experience with psychosis. Today, we are speaking with Brian Stettin with TAC, Treatment Advocacy Center, and Eric Smith, who has a related diagnosis. Brian, let's start off by describing what TAC is and its involvement with AOT-assisted outpatient treatment.
Sure, Sandy. So the Treatment Advocacy Center's roots go back about 20 years. Was founded by a very well-known research psychiatrist by the name of Dr. E. Fuller Torrey. Also someone who was practicing, Dr. Torrey was practicing psychiatry at St. Edward's Hospital in DC, in addition to doing his research on the causes of schizophrenia. And in the course of that work, really found that one of the largest barriers to people to receive care for severe mental illness was that laws had been passed with really the best of intentions and were ostensibly in place to safeguard people's civil rights that were in fact serving as one of the greatest barriers to people achieving recovery. And I'm referring, of course, to the civil commitment laws that were changed in the 1960s and 70s to make it harder to obtain civil commitment for a person in a mental health crisis that did not want treatment as a result of being in a state of delusion or psychosis and not understanding that they had a need for treatment. And so Dr. Torrey went to some of the folks who were funding his research and said, let's start a legal advocacy organization. Let's get some lawyers involved in this that will fight this fight in state legislatures across this country and bring a little bit of common sense balance into some of these laws, not to swing the pendulum back to the other extreme where, in the 1950s, it was ridiculously easy to get somebody civilly committed, but to not have to wait until a person was violent or suicidal before you give them help that they didn't necessarily understand their need for at the moment. And so that organization, the Treatment Advocacy Center, was started in 1998. And from the beginning, one of the major things that TAC has fought for has been the creation of laws that allow for civil commitment to outpatient care, or as we've come to call it, assisted outpatient treatment, or AOT. And this is about getting help for folks who are not in an acute crisis at that moment, such that they need hospital care, but who have a history of falling into that crisis because of the difficulty they have engaging with treatment in the community. So the idea of AOT is if we can civilly commit a person to a course of treatment on an outpatient basis, and also make that a mutual commitment by putting the system under the same legal hook, also under a court order, to actually deliver all the quality services that the person requires, we can help keep people out of that revolving door, help people live in the community and not, get arrested and sent to the hospital again and again, and allow people to achieve recovery and lead the life of their choosing. And so this issue of AOT is actually how I kind of fell into TAC's orbit. I was an assistant attorney general in New York, worked with TAC in 1999 to develop legislation to bring this concept of AOT to New York. We call that Kendra's Law. And, some of the data that we had developed once Kendra's Law went into place really showed this was remarkably effective in helping some of the most challenging people who are in the public mental health system, reducing rates of hospitalization and arrest by really extraordinary measures. And so now that I've kind of come to TAC, which has been about 10 years now, I think it's fair to say we've kind of shifted our focus a little bit because we've achieved enormous success in getting states to create these laws. We now only have 3 left that do not have a law on the books that allows for civil commitment to outpatient care. But that kind of obscures the fact that we have not done such a great job in actually getting local mental health systems to use these laws to establish these AOT programs in their communities that really make this work. And so my own role at TAC has really shifted in recent years to being more focused, not so much on getting laws passed, although that's certainly something TAC is very much involved in beyond this issue of AOT, but really trying to get local communities to use those laws, have AOT programs, and make this happen on a local level. So there are many ways that we're involved in that, but I think I've given you a pretty long answer already.
Okay, well, you know, your website is treatmentadvocacycenter.org, and I was really impressed by how much your organization helps people who otherwise seem to fall in the gaps of the current mental health system.
Sure.
So, Eric, how do you know Brian?
About 10 years ago, Treatment Advocacy Center produced a documentary about the things Brian was just discussing: serious mental illness, assisted outpatient treatment, and I was one of the subjects within that film. Since that time, I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Brian and others at Treatment Advocacy Center in other ways, through public speaking at conferences around the country, discussing AOT from a participant's perspective as part of the AOT training modules for the American Psychiatric Association's SMI advisor. And I also helped shape in a very small way from a participant's perspective, the AOT white paper, of which Brian was one of the main authors. The aim of that paper, which was somewhat recently released, is to highlight and explain the building blocks for a successful AOT program. And Brian would be able to speak to that better than I.
Okay. Brian, did you want to add anything?
Only that Eric is really just an extraordinary human being who I feel very fortunate to know. You know, he can tell you more about his personal story, but he's someone who came to us and was suggested to someone who'd be a good subject for the film that he mentioned, because of what an extraordinary recovery he had achieved, thanks in large part to the fact that he was made a part of the AOT program in San Antonio, Texas, where he lives. And, you know, I'll let Eric tell you more about his story, but the trajectory of his life was completely changed by it. And, you know, he has gone on to inspire so many people in talking about what he went through with no shame whatsoever or sense of stigma about the fact that he has this diagnosis. And, you know, through consistent engagement with treatment, was able to come to recognize that, you know, he has an illness, and taking medication is a part of how he's going to cope and live with it. And, you know, well, I don't want to steal his thunder by telling you too much about his personal story, but, you know, he's just an amazing guy.
So, Eric, I read your bio on the Cures organization website, and that's CureSZ. Can you give us a brief summary of your experience with having a brain disorder, and where did the AOT program fit in?
Yes, and thank you for taking the time to read that bio. Clozapine has been a miracle for me, which I say because over the years, I've taken many different combinations of most every psychiatric drug, all without any lasting benefit. And it got to the point where I was on a cocktail of medications, at any given time, a handful. So let's say between 4 and 7 or 5 and 8 at any given time over a very long period of time, all of these medicines not working for me with any lasting fashion. And now clozapine is the only psych med I require. And I got to that point because AOT was a big part of that equation. Let me briefly summarize my journey for you. There's a lot to unpack there, but this will give you and the listeners a gist of what it was that I went through. There were nearly 2 decades of failed trial and error on many medicines, multiple hospitalizations, unnecessary interactions with police, the FBI, and Secret Service. My parents were exhausted. I was experiencing delusions, paranoia, and other things of the like. And that all led up to me being arrested for a nonviolent offense, which thankfully served to get me hospitalized and then into an AOT program on the outpatient side of things. The AOT program fit into all of this as an innovative solution to the problems born of my mental illness in a way that nothing before it had remedied. AOT saved me from the criminal justice system and from decades of insanity by putting me before an AOT treatment team, including a judge, a doctor, a social worker, and others as part of the team as it was set up in my geographic area. And it really did save me from the insanity I was living over 2 decades and more. And if you fast forward to the present, with large thanks to AOT and the treatment team involved, I graduated magna cum laude with a degree in psychology and am now a graduate student in pursuit of becoming a professional advocate and mental health expert.
Yes, I noticed that you're a graduate student in social work. I actually checked into social work, and due to my paranoia, decided that I would not be able to successfully complete the field work that you do as a student and ongoing as a professional. I'm more interested in the field of academic advising instead. So I'm very impressed with what you were doing. Why social work?
Well, thank you for sharing your story as well. It's people like you who have the courage and the strength to share your story that help others understand that they're not stuck fighting that themselves, and that there's also help out there, and that there's people out there who understand. So I first wanted to answer by saying thank you for sharing as well. So I initially chose actually a Master's of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling degree path and completed 2 semesters in that program. And I still have much respect for that degree and profession, but the more I learned about social work, the more I knew it was the right choice for me, because the counseling path I was on didn't dive into policy advocacy quite as deeply as social work does. And since it's such a passion of mine, at policy advocacy, it made sense for me to go into social work. So last year, I went to Washington, D.C. to meet with a member of the Congressional Mental Health Caucus to champion additional support for AOT. And since that time, I've had the honor and pleasure of doing the same with US senators and members of their staff. And it feels wonderful to be involved in policy advocacy. And for me, it feels like home. It is a lot of work, but it doesn't feel like work. It feels like I'm doing what I was put here to do, to make sure that the story I lived and the horrible things that my family had to live as they were with me on this journey weren't all for nothing, that I'm doing something that I hope will prevent individuals with diagnoses like mine, families like mine, societies in general, from really not having to be drained in the way that I was draining myself and others. And so policy advocacy in and of itself, as part of social work, will continue to be a compass for everything I do.
That's awesome. One of the hardest things I ever had to choose was to decide if I wanted to disclose my diagnosis due to stigma and discrimination. Joanne Verbanek, the founder of the SA support groups, once said the stigma is harder to deal with than the illness itself. Do you disclose your diagnosis to everyone you meet? I know for me, disclosing was freeing because I no longer had the fear of being found out and retaliated against.
Well, the short answer is no, but let's unpack that a bit. So in everyday situations, I don't introduce myself to people by saying, hi, my name is Eric, and I'm diagnosed with serious mental illness. What's your name? I don't want to put people in an awkward spot, and they may not know how to respond. But that said, I don't hide my diagnoses. It just isn't something I usually include in my introduction with people. However, as people get to know me, whether it be professors, classmates, friends, or others, it usually comes up in conversation when the discussion gets around to, what am I studying? What do I want to do with my life when I'm done with school? Which is to be an advocate and mental health professional. And so almost always the following question to that people ask is, why that? And I make no effort to hide that it relates to my personal journey and mental illness that I'm diagnosed with.
Great. Eric and Brian, what do you both do as advocates of brain disorder?
So what do we do as advocates?
Mm-hmm. What is your role? I mean, you've discussed it some, but is there anything outside of what you're doing that you could add as advocates?
Yeah, so, the Treatment Advocacy Center, as I said, my division of it is really focused on trying to get communities to get these assisted outpatient treatment programs off the ground, because we really feel this should be a tool in the toolkit for every public mental health system in the country. And we're a long way from that point, although there are some really amazing programs in certain cities and certain communities who are achieving amazing results. We have not yet even come close to the point where this is something that's happening everywhere. And if you're someone who is caught in the revolving door, you can just very easily get into a program like this. And so we have kind of a multi-pronged strategy to make this a more universal practice. One of the things we're doing is working with the federal agency SAMHSA, which we prevailed upon to establish a grant program so that they are now issuing federal grants to communities that want to start these programs that are in states where they have the laws to do it and have never really done much with them. And so that program is now funding about 17 sites around the country on kind of the phase 1 of that grant, and is about to announce a set of grants to a whole new group of communities that are going to have these programs up and running. And we've been working with all those communities who have established programs with that SAMHSA funding, providing technical assistance, working with them just through sharing the things we've learned about how to make AOT work well, how to do it right, how to sustain a program over the long term, even when that federal funding expires after 4 years. And so we have developed some really amazing relationships with some incredible AOT programs around the country. And we're hoping that that's going to have a domino effect. It's not a whole lot of money. It's not a great number of programs that have been established through this grant funding. But the idea is that by the results that they're achieving, we're hoping that it's going to get other communities around them interested in wanting to get in on these results themselves. And so that we will help, this will be a tool to help us really spread this beyond that. We also, as Eric mentioned, have developed something we call the AOT white paper, which is a document that really speaks to exactly what it takes to make an AOT program work, how to establish one, some tips on how to achieve great results through AOT, and how to put things in place such that you are able to sustain the program over time. And we feel like this is a really great tool, a great starting point for any of the stakeholders that it takes to make an AOT program work, to read and have an understanding of what the next steps are. And of course, for anyone who reads that and gets interested, we're going to, as an organization, come and work with you. And our team is all over the country. Once COVID is safely behind us, are going to be back out flying to cities of all sizes, actually working with people to put some of these ideas in place. And another really kind of exciting related piece is that we have developed online learning modules, an actual online course you can take. So we can't be everywhere at once to actually guide you through this process, but anybody can go to the website SMI Advisor, which is run by the American Psychiatric Association, also through a grant with SAMHSA. On that site, you will find the AOT learning modules. Again, this is designed for all the folks who it takes to make AOT work, be they on the clinical side of things or the court side. And take this course, takes about 3 or 4 hours, and get a real basic understanding of what AOT is and how to get it up and running in your community. So those are just a few of the things that we are involved in to help kind of spread this concept of AOT far and wide.
That sounds great. Eric, what is your opinion of SARDA's advocacy work trying to change the classification of schizophrenia?
So that's a great question, and one that I actually have a lot of interest in, not just because it's a diagnosis of which is relevant to me, but because it's a fascinating discussion. And I want to preface this by saying I am not a medical expert, but I support most any action that increases access to care. And if reclassifying schizophrenia as a brain disorder means more people will have access to medical care, to manage their symptoms, to manage their diagnoses, I support that. And I strongly oppose any policy, any law that gets in the way of people receiving needed medical care. And over the past several years, as part of my undergraduate studies, where we're assigned reading certain articles, I've seen that different types of brain imaging yield pretty consistent evidence that the brains of people with psychiatric illnesses like schizophrenia look different than those who do not have psychiatric illnesses. And while this leads me to believe that diagnoses like schizophrenia are empirically supported as being brain disorders, I'm a layman on the matter. And so it would be irresponsible for me to speak on it. But the evidence is so compelling to me as a layman that I would very much like for the experts who are not willing to budge, they're not willing to change their perspective on the matter, to be more clear, to give a good explanation why, despite the fact what we're seeing in these brain imaging techniques of, let's say, a schizophrenic brain versus someone who does not have a diagnosis like that, why is it that the experts who aren't willing to reclassify it as a brain disorder, where are they coming from? What evidence are they discarding, and what are they using, and why aren't they willing to change their minds? As a layman, I would like to understand that.
Okay, and what about early psychosis treatment centers? Do you think that would have helped you? as they provide supported work and education?
Yes, so when it comes to things where we're at right now with schizophrenia, we don't have a cure per se, but I do think that early intervention is very important for a number of reasons. So there are advocates around the country whom I've gotten to know through going around and doing public speaking and just being a part of the advocacy group that speaks to SMI and AOT. And some of the areas in which they live not only don't have a good AOT program or AOT at all, but don't also have community resources or good where they're at solid early intervention or early educational or anything, any sort of community service or support. And they're really fighting things out themselves, like whether it's, a husband or a wife, single parent, a group family, a non-traditional family. You've got groups of people trying to figure out what to do because they aren't receiving the support they need. And the topic that you just mentioned, I think it would be an excellent tool for people who are feeling like they're fighting this on their own or that they don't have much support is crucial. That won't do anything necessarily to cure serious mental illness, but it will provide a crutch for people who need it, and I'm all for that.
Okay, thank you. And Brian, I noticed one of your tabs on your website is what people can do. I know you addressed that a little bit earlier when you were talking about that course on TAC. What would you suggest for people who are diagnosed and family and friends?
Well, I'd say if you were diagnosed with a severe mental illness and you're fortunate enough to have the insight to accept your diagnosis, recognize that you have an illness that requires treatment, you're far ahead of the game, right? I don't mean to at all minimize how long a road you may face in that situation to achieve recovery and find the meds that work for you. But, that does put you a step ahead of the folks who TAC advocates for, which are, individuals who don't recognize they have an illness and want no part of treatment. So I guess my only real advice for people who do accept their severe mental illness diagnosis is to never let that illness define you or limit your sense of life's possibilities, to, not think of your illness as anything that's more shameful or embarrassing as any other sort of dysfunction that anyone else might experience with an organ of their body, and to just be your own advocate for the treatment you need. And maybe you can get to a place where you can become an advocate for the treatment that other people need and get involved in this movement that we're all a part of for better treatment. But of course, as I say, the real work of TAC is on behalf of people who, by no fault of their own, cannot recognize their need for treatment, that they have an illness, often as a result of this neurological deficit we call anosognosia, right, where a person is certain that they do not have the illness. It's far beyond just denial. A person in denial actually does know the truth deep down, but a person with anosognosia is certain to their core that they do not have this illness and want no part of treatment. And we deal with lots of families who are having that experience with a loved one. And those are really kind of our people. That's really the subset of the mental health advocacy world that is ours. And, for those families, my advice to people, whose hearts are breaking and feel like the situation is hopeless because their loved one won't engage with treatment, I guess the best thing I can tell them is you're not alone. There are great support groups that you can and really should get involved with, such as your local NAMI affiliate. And also just know that as you struggle to navigate the treatment laws in your state to get your loved one either the hospital care they need or the AOT they may need to maintain engagement with treatment while they're living in the community, the Treatment Advocacy Center is here for you. We want to help you to understand the laws of your state, to push back against anyone who's telling you that your loved one isn't eligible for help because they aren't symptomatic enough yet. We want to help you get your loved one into an AOT program if your community has one, or to help you push for this creation of such a program if there is not one already where you live. So please, I would encourage folks dealing with that horrible situation to reach out to us. We'd love to work with you and find ways to help you.
Okay, and any additional comments by you two?
Yeah, just to build on what Brian just said, what I do, what Brian does, what TAC does, what so many people out there who are living this or have an interest in it in some form or fashion, what we do and the importance of what we do is to help people understand that serious mental illness, whether you want to call it a brain disorder, serious mental illness, this is not something that can be solved by the criminal justice system. And we need to continue to help people recognize that, whether it's elected representatives, people who help to set the laws, set up programs, help people understand that civil court proceedings and programs like AOT, that is what's really in place to help people like myself. And the trajectory that I was on, which, I could summarize as I was a high school dropout at one point, diagnosed with serious mental illness. I'd gone through a lot of different medicines, a lot of different psychiatrists, a lot of different types of schools of thought. None of that worked. Multiple hospitalizations, and then eventually, AOT really turned my life around. And the trajectory short of AOT intervening, we know what that looks like. Those are a lot of things stacked against someone in a story. And I would not have stopped until I was put 6 feet under, if not for AOT. And that struggle that I went through and that so many families have gone through, and these stories that we hear like that, we owe thanks to people like you, to people like Brian and the organizations you both represent, for not giving up on someone like me, for helping society to understand that I'm worth it, for helping me to understand that I'm worth it, and really for having the courage to not give up. And I really appreciate the hope that you all bring to others. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I'm sure our viewers have learned a lot. Thank you again.